The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a pizza coupon and a water bill. It was thick, creamy parchment that felt out of place in Arthur's cramped, fluorescent-lit apartment. It informed him that his great Uncle Silas had passed away. Arthur barely remembered the man, only a vague memory of a tall, silent figure at a funeral who smelled of old paper and cedarwood. But Silas had left him everything. A sprawling estate known as Blackwood Reach, nestled in the damp, fog-heavy woods of the Pacific Northwest. Arthur arrived at the gates 3 days later. The house was a skeletal Victorian structure, its wood blackened by decades of rain. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a warning. The interior was worse. Every room was filled with mirrors, not just one or two on the walls, but dozens. Hand mirrors sat on side tables. Floor-length mirrors lined the hallways. Even the ceiling in the grand foyer was a checkered mosaic of reflective glass. As Arthur moved through the house, his reflection followed him from 100 different angles. He felt a strange, dizzying sensation, the feeling that he wasn't just walking through a house, but through a crowd of himself. By the second night, the silence of the woods began to grate on his nerves. He sat in the library, trying to read by the light of a single lamp. The room was circular, lined with dark oak shelves and, of course, 3 massive mirrors behind the desk. Arthur looked up from his book. In the mirror directly in front of him, he saw his reflection. It was hunched over, just as he was. But as Arthur reached for his glass of water, his heart skipped a beat. In the reflection, his hand didn't move. Arthur froze. He stared at the glass. For 3 long seconds, his reflection remained still, staring down at the book Arthur was no longer reading. Then, slowly, the reflection looked up. It met Arthur's eyes. It didn't smile. It didn't scream. It simply blinked. Arthur bolted from the room, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ran to the master bedroom and slammed the door, locking it. He avoided the vanity mirror, throwing a heavy blanket over it before collapsing into bed. He told himself it was the exhaustion, the isolation, the way the light played tricks in an old house. But as he drifted into a fitful sleep, he heard a sound that made his skin turn to ice. Plink, plink, plink. It was the sound of a fingernail tapping against glass. It wasn't coming from the vanity. It was coming from the window. He didn't look. He buried his head under the pillow until the sun rose. The third day brought a heavy, suffocating fog that erased the trees outside. Arthur tried to leave, but his car wouldn't start. The battery was drained, though he knew he'd left nothing on. He was trapped. He spent the afternoon searching for a toolkit, but instead, he found Uncle Silas's diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the study. The entries were frantic, the handwriting deteriorating into a jagged scrawl toward the end. They are tired of being shadows. One entry read, "They watch, they mimic, but the glass is getting thinner. Silas, you fool, you let them see you blink first. Now they know the way out." The last entry was dated 2 days before Silas's death. It was just one sentence, written over and over until the ink bled through the paper. "Do not let the lights go out." Arthur checked the cupboards. He found a box of emergency candles and 3 flashlights. He spent the remaining daylight hours lining them up on the kitchen island. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the house began to groan. The mirrors seemed to hum with a low-frequency vibration that Arthur could feel in his teeth. He lit the candles, placing them in the center of the rooms, creating small islands of light in the vast, creeping dark. He sat in the kitchen, clutching a flashlight. He watched the reflection in the polished chrome of the toaster. He watched the reflection in the window. Around 11 p.m., the first candle went out. There was no draft, no open window. The flames simply vanished, as if pinched by invisible fingers. Then the second, then the third. Arthur clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the large mirror in the dining room. In the reflection, the kitchen was full of people. They were all him. Dozens of Arthurs stood in the reflected kitchen. Some were sitting at the table he had just vacated. Some were standing right behind his chair. One was leaning over his shoulder, its face inches from his own. But when Arthur spun around, the kitchen was empty. He swung the flashlight back to the mirror. The reflections were moving now, independently of him. They were walking toward the surface of the glass, their hands reaching out, pressing against the silvered boundary. The glass began to crack. Not a sharp shatter, but a slow, spiderwebbing fracture. CRRRAC. Arthur backed away, tripping over a chair. He scrambled toward the front door, but as his flashlight swept over the hallway mirrors, he saw them, the other Arthurs, stepping out of the frames. They didn't have shadows, and they didn't make a sound. They moved with a sickening, fluid grace, their limbs slightly too long, their skin the color of unpolished lead. They were stepping into his world, and as they did, Arthur felt himself becoming thin. He looked down at his hands. They were becoming translucent. He could see the floorboards through his palms. The more of them that entered the room, the more of him faded away. He reached the front door and heaved it open. The fog rushed in like a cold shroud. He ran into the woods, not caring about the branches tearing at his clothes or the mud sucking at his boots. He just needed to get away from the glass. He ran until his lungs burned, until he reached the edge of the property where a small, stagnant pond sat under the moonlight. He collapsed at the water's edge, gasping for air. He looked down into the water to splash his face. The surface of the pond was still, like a mirror. Arthur froze. In the reflection of the water, he saw himself. But the reflection was standing in a bright, sunlit version of the woods. The reflected Arthur looked happy. He looked solid. The real Arthur, the one kneeling in the mud, looked down and saw that his legs had already vanished. He was nothing more than a gray mist, a fading memory. The reflection in the water reached down. Its hand broke the surface, but it didn't get wet. It gripped Arthur's wrist with a terrifying iron strength. "Thank you," the reflection whispered. The voice didn't come from the air. It vibrated up through Arthur's own bones. "It's been so cold in there." With a violent jerk, the reflection pulled. Arthur felt a sensation of falling upward. The world turned inside out. The smell of pine and mud was replaced by the smell of old paper and ozone. Arthur blinked. He was standing in the sunlit woods. He felt solid. He felt heavy. He reached out and touched a tree. The bark was rough and real. He laughed, a short, hysterical sound. He was out. He was free. But then he looked down at the pond. There, beneath the surface of the water, trapped in a gray, sunless twilight, was a figure. It was kneeling in the mud, its face pressed against the underside of the water as if it were a sheet of glass. It was screaming, but no sound came out, only a stream of silent, silver bubbles. Arthur looked at his own reflection in the water. It didn't mimic him. It just watched him with wide, pleading eyes. Arthur turned away. He walked toward the car, the keys heavy in his pocket. He didn't look back at the pond. He didn't look at the windows of the house. He got into the car and looked into the rearview mirror to back out. His reflection wasn't there. The mirror was empty. Arthur smiled, put the car in gear, and drove away. Behind him, in the silent house of 100 mirrors, 100 versions of Arthur began to scream. And for the first time in 50 years, the reflections began to clap.